The sun beat down on the cotton fields of Tensas Parish, Louisiana, on July 14, 1858, when Margaret Hayes collapsed between the rows. She was 23 years old. Her hands bled through the rough fabric she'd wrapped around them that morning. The overseer's whip had already found her back twice before noon. But it wasn't the pain that made her knees buckle. It was the words that came from the big house, carried by a house servant who whispered them with eyes full of fear. Master Thornton Caldwell had decided. Margaret's 8-year-old daughter would be sold south to the sugar plantations by week's end. The child's price would cover his gambling debts in Natchez. Margaret didn't scream. She had learned years ago that screaming only brought more pain. But something broke inside her that day, something that had been bending for a long time. She thought of her brother. She thought of Samuel, who lived in the quarters beyond the tobacco barns, who couldn't see the world with his eyes, but seemed to see everything else with a clarity that frightened even the white men who owned them. Samuel, who stood 2 meters and 10 centimeters tall, whose shoulders were so broad he had to turn sideways to enter most doors. Samuel, who had been blind since birth but moved through the world like he carried a map inside his soul. The other enslaved people whispered about Samuel Hayes. They said he could hear a lie before it left a man's mouth. They said he knew when rain was coming 3 days before the clouds appeared. They said his hands, massive and scarred from years of labor, had never struck another person in anger, but everyone knew what those hands could do if they chose to. Master Caldwell knew it too. That's why he had never raised a whip to Samuel directly, though he had profited from Samuel's strength for 12 years. Before we continue this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Stories like this must never be forgotten. Let's continue. Tensas Parish sat in the northeastern corner of Louisiana, where the Mississippi River carved its path through rich soil that white men had built their fortunes upon. By 1858, the parish held over 8,000 enslaved people, outnumbering the white population nearly 5 to 1. The Caldwell plantation stretched across 900 acres, with 230 people held in bondage there, growing cotton, tobacco, and corn. Thornton Caldwell had inherited the land from his father in 1847, and in 11 years he had expanded it considerably, though not through wisdom or hard work. He expanded it through cruelty, through calculated brutality, and through the sale of human beings when his card games went poorly. Caldwell was 41 years old that summer, a tall man with graying hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the meanness that lived behind his eyes. He wore expensive clothes ordered from New Orleans, drank French wine, and fancied himself a gentleman of culture and refinement. But the enslaved people who worked his land knew different. They knew about the women he forced into his bed. They knew about the children he sold away without a second thought. They knew about the special cruelty he reserved for anyone who showed even a flicker of pride or resistance. Margaret had been born on the Caldwell plantation. Her mother had died bringing Samuel into the world, and Margaret, just 3 years old at the time, had helped raise her baby brother. She remembered holding him in the quarters, this impossibly large infant who never cried, whose eyes looked past her even then, unfocused but somehow aware. As Samuel grew, so did the mystery of him. By age 5, he was taller than children twice his age. By 10, he was doing the work of a grown man. By 15, he was the strongest person on the plantation, slave or free, and his blindness seemed less like a disability and more like a different way of perceiving the world entire. The white doctors who examined Samuel called his condition congenital blindness, likely caused by complications during birth. But the enslaved community had their own understanding. The old women who remembered Africa said Samuel had been touched by something beyond this world, that he had been marked for a purpose. They said his ancestors walked beside him, guiding his steps. Whether any of that was true didn't matter much to the practical reality of life in bondage. What mattered was that Samuel could navigate the plantation grounds without a cane, that he could harness a mule team by the sound of their breathing, that he could split fence posts with an accuracy that seemed impossible for someone who couldn't see the wood. Margaret had protected Samuel when they were children, but as they grew, the protection began to flow the other way. Samuel seemed to know when his sister was in trouble before she did. He would appear, silent and immense, whenever an overseer got too rough with her. He never threatened, never raised his voice, but his presence alone was enough to make most men reconsider their actions. Master Caldwell had noticed this, of course. He noticed everything that happened on his land, and he resented it deeply. The resentment had been building for years. Caldwell was the kind of man who needed to feel powerful, who fed on the fear and submission of others. Samuel's quiet strength challenged that need, in ways Caldwell couldn't fully articulate, but felt viscerally. The fact that a blind slave could command such respect, could move with such confidence, could protect his sister without ever saying a word directly against any white man, it ate at Caldwell like acid. He looked for opportunities to break Samuel's spirit, but those opportunities never quite arrived. Samuel never disobeyed a direct order. He never spoke disrespectfully. He simply existed in a way that suggested he was more than what Caldwell wanted him to be, and that was unforgivable. The decision to sell Margaret's daughter wasn't primarily about money, though Caldwell did owe nearly $800 to a planter in Natchez. It was about power. It was about reminding everyone on the plantation who held their lives in his hands. And it was about hurting Samuel through the one person he cared about most. Caldwell had watched brother and sister together. He had seen how Margaret guided Samuel through new spaces, how Samuel listened for Margaret's voice in a crowd. He understood that the bond between them was the strongest thing in their lives, stronger even than the chains and laws that held them in slavery. The evening Margaret heard about her daughter's fate, she waited until full dark before making her way to the quarters where Samuel lived. The July heat hadn't broken with sunset. The air hung thick and still, carrying the smell of wood smoke and the distant Mississippi. She found her brother sitting outside his small cabin, his face turned toward the sound of her approaching footsteps. He knew her walk, just as he knew the walk of everyone on the plantation. Before she could speak, he said her name. Just that. Margaret. And in the way he said it, she knew that he already knew. "They taking my baby." Her voice came out flat, emptied of everything except fact. Master Caldwell selling her to the sugar country. Samuel didn't move. His massive hands rested on his knees, his blind eyes fixed on nothing and everything. For a long moment, the only sound was the crickets and the far-off singing from another quarter. Then he spoke, and his voice was gentle, which somehow made the words more terrible. "I know. I heard them talking this morning when they thought I was working on the other side of the barn." Margaret sank down beside him. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. She had cried too much in her life already, and her body seemed to have run dry. "What am I going to do, Samuel? She's 8 years old. She won't survive the sugar fields. You know what happens to children down there." They both knew. Everyone knew. The sugar plantations of deep Louisiana were death sentences. The work was so brutal, the conditions so harsh, that enslaved people survived an average of 7 years after arrival. Children lasted less. The grinding season ran 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, with the ever-present danger of the boiling sugar vats and the crushing machinery. Margaret's daughter, a small child named Sarah who loved to sing and picked wildflowers when she could steal a moment, would be gone within 2 years. Probably less. Samuel turned his head slightly, as if looking at something in the distance, though his eyes saw nothing but darkness. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Margaret knew what she wanted. She wanted her brother to walk up to the big house, to take Thornton Caldwell by the throat, to end the man who was destroying their family. She wanted violence and justice, and she hated herself for wanting it because she knew what would follow. Even if Samuel succeeded, even if he killed Caldwell, the white men would come, The law would come. They would make an example that would echo across every plantation in Louisiana. Samuel would die, and probably Margaret too, and Sarah anyway, and dozens more besides, because white society couldn't allow slaves to strike back against masters, no matter the provocation. "I want my child safe," Margaret finally said, "but I don't know how that's possible in this world." Samuel nodded slowly, his face unreadable in the darkness. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," he said. "Not about Sarah specifically, but about all of it, about what we are, what they've made us, what we might become. And I've been listening, really listening, to everything." Margaret didn't understand, but she waited. Samuel often spoke in ways that seemed strange at first, but made sense eventually. He continued, his voice low and steady. "Master Caldwell is afraid. Not of work, not of losing money, not even of God's judgment," continued, his voice low and steady. "Master Caldwell is afraid. Not of work, not of losing money, not even of God's judgment. He's afraid of being seen as weak. Everything he does comes from that fear. The way he beats people, the way he sells children, the way he looks at me like he wants to prove something. He needs everyone to believe he's powerful, because deep down, he knows he's not. He's just a man who inherited land and people, and without that inheritance, he'd be nothing." This was true, and Margaret knew it. But truth didn't save children from being sold. "That doesn't help Sarah," she said. "No," Samuel agreed, "but it tells us what might. See, a man who needs to prove his power is a man who can be manipulated through his pride. He makes mistakes because he can't resist opportunities to show how strong he is, and I think if we're careful, we might be able to use that." Margaret felt something stir in her chest, something that might have been hope or might have been fear. "What are you saying?" Samuel reached out and found her hand in the darkness, his fingers gentle despite their size. "I'm saying that there are things Master Caldwell wants more than money. I'm saying that there are ways to make him reconsider his decisions without ever raising a hand against him. I'm saying that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is survive long enough to find the right moment, and I think that moment is coming." He didn't explain further, and Margaret didn't press him. She had learned to trust her brother's instincts, even when she didn't understand them. They sat together in the darkness, two people who had been born into bondage, but who somehow, against all logic and law, had not let that bondage enter their souls completely. Around them the plantation slept uneasily, white people dreaming in their big houses, black people dreaming in their small cabins. Everyone caught in the same terrible system, everyone playing roles that history had written for them. But history, as Samuel had somehow understood, was not finished writing. And sometimes the blind see things that those with clear vision miss entirely. The next morning came too soon, as mornings always did on the plantation. The bell rang before dawn, calling everyone to work. Margaret dragged herself from her cabin, her body aching from yesterday's labor and her heart aching from fear for her daughter. She had maybe 4 days left with Sarah before the trader came. 4 days to memorize her child's face, her voice, her laugh. 4 days before that piece of herself was torn away forever. Except Samuel had said something was coming. And if there was one thing Margaret had learned in 23 years of life, it was that her brother was rarely wrong. Master Caldwell emerged from the big house around 7 that morning, already dressed in his fine clothes despite the heat. He carried a riding crop, not because he planned to ride anywhere, but because he liked the feel of it in his hand, liked the way enslaved people's eyes tracked it nervously. He surveyed his domain with satisfaction, watching the field hands moving between cotton rows, hearing the sound of axes from the timber crew, smelling breakfast cooking in the kitchen house. Everything was as it should be. Everything was under his control. He didn't see Samuel at first. Samuel was working near the barn, splitting logs for fence posts. The sound of the axe biting into wood carried across the yard in a steady rhythm, almost musical. Caldwell frowned. There was something about that rhythm that bothered him, something too confident, too measured. He walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the dusty ground. Samuel heard him coming, of course. He stopped working and turned toward the approaching footsteps, his blind eyes pointing slightly past Caldwell's left shoulder. His face showed nothing, no fear, no resentment, no emotion at all, just patient waiting. "You're Samuel," Caldwell said, though he knew perfectly well who Samuel was. He wanted to see if the slave would correct him, would show any flash of pride or irritation at being treated as unknown. "Yes, master," Samuel replied, his voice neutral and respectful. Caldwell circled him slowly, studying this man who stood nearly 7 feet tall, whose muscles were clearly defined, even through his worn work shirt, whose presence seemed to fill more space than his body actually occupied. "They tell me you're the strongest Negro in Tensas Parish," Caldwell said. "That true?" "I don't know, master. I just do my work." "Can't see nothing at all, can you?" "No, master. Been blind since birth." Caldwell smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Must be hard, living in darkness all the time. Never seeing a sunrise, never seeing a woman's face, never seeing who's standing right in front of you. I almost pity you." Samuel said nothing, but something in his posture shifted ever so slightly, a subtle stiffening that Caldwell caught and filed away for future use. Good. There was pride there after all, hidden beneath the surface. Pride could be used. Pride could be broken. "I'm selling your sister's child," Caldwell said, watching Samuel's face carefully. "Taking her south to the sugar country. Traders coming Friday. You have any thoughts about that, Samuel?" For a moment, Samuel's jaw tightened. Just for a moment. Then his face went smooth again, that mask of patience returning. "She's your property, master. Not my place to have thoughts about your decisions." "That's right," Caldwell said softly. "That's exactly right. You're smart enough to understand how things work, at least. Smarter than most. But let me be clear, because I know how close you are to Margaret. If there's any trouble at all between now and Friday, I'll sell Margaret too. And then I'll sell you to the worst slave breaker I can find, someone who specializes in teaching pride out of uppity Negroes. You understand me?" "Yes, master." "Good." Caldwell turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. I'm having a gathering here Saturday, after the trader leaves. Some planters from Natchez and Vidalia coming by, and I like to show off my operation. I want you there, showing what you can do despite your affliction. Demonstrate that strength everyone talks about. Make me look good in front of my guests. You'll do that for me, won't you?" Samuel's blind eyes tracked slightly toward where Caldwell's voice originated. "Yes, master. Whatever you want." Caldwell walked away, satisfied. He had reminded the slave of his place, had asserted his control, had even set up an opportunity to show off one of his more unusual properties to his fellow planters. It never occurred to him that he had also done exactly what Samuel had predicted the night before. He had let his pride dictate his actions. He had created an opportunity because he couldn't resist demonstrating his power. And Samuel, standing in the yard with his axe in hand, his face turned toward the sun he couldn't see, allowed himself the smallest smile. The kind of smile that suggested a man counting cards in his head, planning moves ahead while his opponent still gloated over the current hand. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of time. Margaret went through the motions of work, her hands picking cotton while her mind stayed with her daughter. Sarah sensed something wrong, the way children always do, and she clung closer to her mother than usual. Margaret wanted to tell her, wanted to prepare her. But how do you prepare an 8-year-old child for being sold away from everyone she knows and loves? How do you explain that she's about to enter a hell that will likely kill her before she reaches adulthood? So Margaret said nothing, just held Sarah whenever she could, memorizing the weight of her, the smell of her hair, the sound of her breathing. Samuel continued his work with his usual efficiency, but everyone on the plantation sensed something different about him. He moved with purpose, as if following a plan only he could perceive. He had conversations with the older enslaved people, the ones who remembered things from before, who carried knowledge passed down through generations. He spent time near the big house, listening to the white people talk, his enhanced hearing catching fragments of conversation that others missed. And he worked on the fence post with particular care, selecting wood of specific sizes and weights, cutting them with precision that seemed unnecessary for their purpose. Continuing Part 1. Thursday evening, the night before the trader was scheduled to arrive, Samuel asked to speak with the overseer, a man named William Briggs, who had worked for the Caldwells for 6 years. Briggs was suspicious. Slaves didn't normally request audiences, but his curiosity won out. He found Samuel in the barn, standing among the fence posts he'd been cutting all week. "What do you want?" Briggs asked, his hand resting casually on the pistol he kept at his belt. Samuel turned toward his voice. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I wanted to talk about Saturday's gathering. Master Caldwell said he wants me to demonstrate my strength for the visitors." "So, what about it?" "I was thinking, sir, that it might be more impressive if I had proper equipment. Something that would really show what I can do. These fence posts I've been cutting, for instance, some of them weigh 200 pounds or more. If Master Caldwell wanted, I could lift them, throw them, break them in half with my hands, make it a real show for the gentlemen." Briggs considered this. He had been told to make sure Saturday's demonstration was impressive, and what Samuel suggested would certainly accomplish that. "Master Caldwell wants you breaking his good fence posts?" "I could cut new ones next week, sir. These are extras anyway. And imagine what those planters would think, seeing a blind man handle wood that heavy like it was nothing. Master Caldwell would look real good, owning a slave like that." The appeal to Caldwell's vanity was calculated and effective. Briggs nodded slowly. "I'll ask him. But you better make it worth his while, Samuel. Master's been talking about how he might get a good price for you soon, selling you to someone who needs heavy labor. You want to stay here near your sister? You'll perform well on Saturday." Samuel bowed his head in apparent submission. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." After Briggs left, Samuel ran his hands over the fence posts carefully. He had selected each one for specific properties: weight, length, grain patterns, the way the wood had seasoned. To anyone watching, they looked like ordinary fence posts, but Samuel knew different. He knew which one was slightly softer than the others, where the wood grain ran in, but exactly how much force would be required to break each one at its weakest point. He had been preparing for 3 days, and now all the pieces were falling into place. That night, Margaret came to him again. She looked exhausted, hollowed out by grief. "The trader comes tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "Master Caldwell told me I could have until dawn with Sarah. One last night, and then she's gone." Samuel reached out, pulled his sister into an embrace. She was so much smaller than him, but she had always been the strong one, the one who had raised him, who had taught him to navigate a world he couldn't see. She was crying now, silent tears that soaked into his shirt. "Trust me one more day," Samuel whispered into her hair. "Just one more day, Margaret. I know I'm asking the impossible, but I need you to trust me until Saturday night. Can you do that?" She pulled back, confused. "What can you possibly do? The trader comes in the morning. Sarah will be gone before Saturday." "Maybe," Samuel said. "Maybe not. But either way, I need you to stay strong. I need you to remember that you're more than what they've tried to make you, and I need you to keep Sarah calm tomorrow, no matter what happens. Can you do that for me?" Margaret didn't understand, but she had learned to trust the strange certainty that sometimes entered her brother's voice. She nodded against his chest. "I'll try. That's all I ask," Samuel said gently. And then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, he added, "Master Caldwell thinks he knows what power is. But he's about to learn different. Friday morning arrived with brutal finality. The trader, a man named Joseph Hendricks, who specialized in procuring children for the Deep South plantations, rode up to the Caldwell house at 8 o'clock. He was a thin man with nervous hands and calculating eyes, the kind of person who had learned to see human beings as merchandise and seemed proud of this ability. Master Caldwell greeted him warmly, offering coffee and pastries while they negotiated the price for an 8-year-old girl who could pick cotton and hadn't yet learned to be troublesome. Margaret stood in the yard, holding Sarah close. Other enslaved people gathered at a respectful distance, bearing witness to another family being torn apart, their faces showing the careful blankness that came from watching terrible things you were powerless to stop. Sarah was crying quietly, her small face pressed against her mother's side. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she understood enough. Samuel stood apart, near the barn, his face turned toward the scene he couldn't see but could hear all too clearly. His massive hands were clenched at his sides, the only outward sign of the rage that must have been burning inside him. William Briggs watched him carefully, one hand on his pistol, ready for trouble. But Samuel didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything except stand there like a statue carved from grief. Caldwell and Hendricks emerged from the house, their business concluded. Caldwell had gotten $650 for Sarah, enough to cover most of his Natchez debts. He was pleased with himself, in the way that men who have just profited from evil often are. He gestured toward Margaret. "Bring the girl over here," he called. Margaret's legs seemed to stop working. She couldn't move, couldn't make herself take those steps that would hand her child to the trader. Other enslaved people reached out to support her, to help her walk, but their touch seemed to make it worse. This was the moment, the actual ending, the point of no return. And then Samuel spoke. Not loudly, but his voice carried across the yard with perfect clarity. "Master Caldwell." Everyone froze. Slaves didn't interrupt white men's business, ever. Caldwell turned slowly, his face already darkening with anger. "What did you say, Samuel?" Samuel took 3 steps forward, his movements controlled and deliberate. "Begging your pardon, Master, but I wanted to remind you about tomorrow's gathering. I've been preparing like you asked. Got some fence posts ready that should really impress your guests. But I'm thinking, with all the upset this morning, maybe it'd be better to do the demonstration today instead. Give everyone something else to think about. And your visitor, Mr. Hendricks here, he might enjoy seeing what your operation can produce. Might even consider it part of the value of doing business with you." It was masterfully done. Samuel had offered Caldwell an opportunity to show off, to demonstrate his superiority, to perform power in front of witnesses. And he had done it in a way that seemed like servile consideration rather than manipulation. Caldwell's anger faded slightly, replaced by the familiar hunger to be admired. Hendricks, for his part, was intrigued. "I wouldn't mind seeing this," he said. "Heard some stories about your blind giant here. Be interesting to see if they're true." Caldwell considered for a moment. The demonstration was supposed to be tomorrow, but having it today would serve the same purpose. And it would delay the unpleasantness with Margaret and her child, which was starting to make even him slightly uncomfortable. The woman's grief was so naked, so raw, that it was affecting the mood. "Fine," Caldwell decided. "Samuel, show Mr. Hendricks what you can do. Briggs, set it up." The overseer quickly organized things. The fence posts Samuel had prepared were brought out into the yard, each one a thick piece of oak or hickory that would have taken 2 normal men to carry comfortably. Samuel moved among them confidently, his hands running over the wood, selecting specific pieces. To the watching white men, it looked like showmanship. To Margaret, who knew her brother better than anyone, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like preparation. "This one first," Samuel said, lifting a fence post that must have weighed close to 250 pounds. He held it overhead with both hands, making it look effortless despite his blindness. The enslaved people watching knew this was genuinely impressive. The white men were impressed too, but for different reasons. They saw confirmation of what they wanted to believe about themselves. That they could control even the strongest, most capable people. That power came from ownership rather than from any inherent quality. Samuel held the post for a long moment, then brought it down with careful precision, sinking one end into the soft ground near the barn. He moved to the next post, then the next, creating a line of standing posts. His movements were fluid, almost like a dance, and his blind eyes seemed to see every detail of what he was creating. Margaret watched, confused. This wasn't just a strength demonstration, this was something else. But what? Caldwell was enjoying himself now. He turned to Hendricks with a proprietary smile. Impressive, isn't he? Born blind, but you'd never know it watching him work. Worth every penny I paid for his mother, God rest her soul. How much you think a slave like that would fetch? Hendricks asked, his merchant's mind always calculating. Oh, I'd never sell Samuel, Caldwell said, though he had threatened exactly that just yesterday. Too valuable right where he is. But if I did, probably $1,800, maybe $2,000. Prime buck, unusual ability, never been sick a day in his life. Samuel was working on his final arrangement now, placing posts in specific positions, his hands moving with absolute certainty. And then he stopped, turning toward where Caldwell and Hendricks stood. Master, Samuel said, for the final demonstration, I'd like to try something special. I'm going to break one of these posts in half with my bare hands. But I want you to choose which one so your guests tomorrow and Mr. Hendricks today, they'll know it's real, that there's no trick to it. Caldwell grinned. This was even better than he'd hoped. Any of them? Any of them, Samuel confirmed. That one, Caldwell said, pointing to the thickest post in the line, a piece of oak nearly a foot in diameter. Break that one if you can. Samuel nodded. He walked to the post Caldwell had indicated, but he didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, he placed both hands on it, feeling its surface, as if reading something written in the wood grain. The yard had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching now, white and black alike, all of them caught in the strange tension of the moment. Then Samuel spoke again, and his voice had changed. There was something in it now that hadn't been there before, something that made people instinctively straighten up and pay closer attention. Master Caldwell, he said, still touching the post, before I do this, I want to ask you a question. May I? Caldwell was too intrigued to refuse. Go ahead. Why do you think I can do this? Break wood that most men couldn't even lift. What makes someone like me so strong? It was a strange question, and Caldwell wasn't sure how to answer it. I suppose you were born that way, he said finally. Some kind of gift from God, maybe, though it seems wasted on a Negro who can't even see. Samuel smiled, and there was something terrible in that smile, something that made Briggs's hand move back toward his pistol. That's where you're wrong, Master. It's not about being born strong. It's about what strength really is. You think strength is muscles, power is violence, control is ownership, but you're missing something important. What's that? Caldwell asked, and there was a warning edge to his voice now. This conversation was moving in directions he didn't like. Strength, Samuel said gently, is knowing who you are when everything tries to tell you you're nothing. Power is surviving what should have destroyed you. And control. He lifted the massive post with one hand, holding it horizontal like a spear. Control is an illusion that weak men tell themselves so they can sleep at night. Then, before anyone could react, Samuel brought the post down across his knee with devastating force. The sound of wood splitting echoed across. He took the two halves and brought them together, snapping them again and again, reducing what had been solid oak to kindling in a matter of seconds. His movements were precise, controlled, terrifying in their efficiency. When he was done, he dropped the broken pieces at Caldwell's feet and stood there, breathing easily, his blind eyes fixed on nothing and everything. The yard was completely silent. Thornton Caldwell stared at the shattered wood scattered around his boots. His face had gone pale, then red, cycling through colors like a man struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. It wasn't the breaking of the post that had shaken him. He'd expected that, had asked for it even. It was everything else. The way Samuel had spoken, the strange authority in his voice, the absolute confidence in those movements. And most disturbing of all, the feeling that somehow, in some way Caldwell couldn't quite define. The power dynamic in his own yard had just shifted. Joseph Hendricks let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, trying to break the tension with casual conversation, "that's something you don't see every day. Your boy's got real ability, Caldwell. Real ability indeed." But Caldwell wasn't listening. He was watching Samuel, watching the way the other enslaved people were watching Samuel, seeing something in their faces that terrified him more than any physical threat could. They were looking at Samuel like he had just done something impossible. Not the breaking of the wood. Something else. Something that had happened in the speaking, in the claiming of a kind of dignity that slaves weren't supposed to possess. "Get back to work," Caldwell snapped at Samuel, his voice harsher than he'd intended. "All of you, back to work. Show's over." The enslaved people dispersed slowly, reluctantly, their eyes lingering on Samuel as he turned and walked back toward the barn with that same confident stride. Margaret stood frozen where she'd been throughout the demonstration, Sarah still clinging to her side. The child had stopped crying during Samuel's performance, distracted by the spectacle, but now the reality of the situation came flooding back. The trader was still here. The sale was still happening. Except something had changed in Caldwell's demeanor. He looked at Sarah, then at Margaret, then back toward the barn where Samuel had disappeared. His jaw worked as he ground his teeth, thinking through implications, weighing options. Finally, he turned to Hendricks. "Come back inside," Caldwell said abruptly. "I need to reconsider some things." Hendricks raised an eyebrow but followed Caldwell back into the house. William Briggs watched them go, confusion evident on his face. Margaret didn't dare hope, didn't dare let herself believe that anything might have changed. But she felt Sarah's grip on her dress loosen slightly, felt the child's breathing begin to steady. Inside the big house, Caldwell poured himself a whiskey despite the early hour. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. Hendricks waited patiently, his merchant's instincts telling him that something interesting was about to happen. "I need to think about this sale," Caldwell said finally. "That girl's mother, Margaret, she's Samuel's sister, the only family he has. And Samuel, well, you saw what he can do." "I did," Hendricks agreed. "Impressive specimen. But I don't see what that has to do with the girl. You need the money for your Natchez debts, don't you? That's what you told me in your letter." Caldwell drank more whiskey. His pride was at war with his practical sense, and he didn't like the conclusion he was reaching. Samuel's been docile his whole life, never caused a moment's trouble. But if I take his only family away, if I push him too far, I don't know what he might do. You saw how he looked at me out there. You felt what I felt. "He's still just one slave," Hendricks pointed out. "Blind at that. What can he really do?" "It's not what he can do," Caldwell said quietly. "It's what the others might do if he decides to do it. They look up to him, Hendricks. I've seen it. And a slave that other slaves follow, that's more dangerous than any amount of physical strength. The last thing I need is an uprising, especially right before I'm hosting planters from 3 parishes. If word got out that I couldn't control my own property, I'd be ruined socially. Probably financially too." Hendricks nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "So, you want to keep the girl? Use her as insurance, keep Samuel in line." "Exactly." Caldwell poured another whiskey. "I'll find the money somewhere else. Sell off some of the older slaves, ones that aren't as productive anyway, or maybe I'll just delay paying Natchez for a few months. But taking Samuel's sister's child right now, after what just happened, that feels like lighting a match near a powder keg. It was cowardice disguised as wisdom, fear masked as strategy. But Hendricks didn't judge. He was a businessman, and he understood risk management. "Your loss," he said with a shrug, "but I respect a man who knows his own property well enough to anticipate problems. Most planters wait until there's blood in the dirt before they realize they've pushed too hard." They settled accounts. Caldwell paid Hendricks $50 for his travel expenses and trouble, and the trader rode away empty-handed, already thinking about his next transaction. Caldwell stood on his porch, watching the dust from Hendricks' horse settle, feeling like he'd just been manipulated but unable to figure out exactly how. Outside in the yard, word was spreading among the enslaved people that the sale had been cancelled. Margaret heard it from a house servant who came running with tears in her eyes, and for a moment, Margaret couldn't process the information. Cancelled? How? Why? But then she saw Master Caldwell emerge from the house, saw him gesture curtly at William Briggs, saw the overseer's surprised expression as Caldwell gave him new instructions. Briggs walked over to Margaret, his face carefully neutral. "The sale's off," he said bluntly. "Master changed his mind. You and your girl get back to your quarters. You'll be working in the kitchen house starting Monday where he can keep an eye on you." Margaret's knees almost gave out. Sarah looked up at her mother with confused hope, not quite understanding what was happening but sensing the change in atmosphere. "Mama?" "Hush now," Margaret whispered, pulling her daughter close. "Just hush." She didn't go back to her quarters. She went straight to the barn, moving as fast as she dared without actually running, because running drew attention, and attention from white people was always dangerous. She found Samuel sitting on a pile of hay, his face turned toward the sound of her approaching footsteps. "Samuel," she breathed, "what did you do?" "I reminded Master Caldwell of something he'd forgotten," Samuel said calmly. "That fear is stronger than greed. That reputation is more valuable than $650. That sometimes the appearance of power is all powerful men really have, and they'll do anything to protect it." Margaret sank down beside him, her whole body trembling with relief and delayed terror and a dozen other emotions she couldn't name. "You could have been killed. If he'd thought you were threatening him, if he'd taken it the wrong way, he would have had you whipped to death or worse." "I know," Samuel said simply, "but I also knew he wouldn't, because I understand him, Margaret. I've been listening to that man for 12 years, hearing the way he talks, the way he moves, the way his voice changes when he's truly afraid versus when he's just angry. He's not stupid. He's cruel and he's proud, but he's not stupid. And he understood what I was really telling him out there." "What were you telling him?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, his blind eyes distant. "That I'm not property in my own mind. That I never have been, no matter what the law says. That my body might be enslaved, but my soul isn't. And that if he pushed me too far, if he took away the only thing in this world I care about, I would stop pretending to be what he needs me to be. I would stop being the docile giant who makes him look good. I would become something else entirely, and we both know what that would cost him." It was the most dangerous thing Samuel had ever said out loud, and Margaret understood why he'd waited until they were alone to say it. Even thinking such thoughts could get a slave killed if the wrong person overheard. But Samuel had not just thought them. He had communicated them, carefully and indirectly, in a way that Caldwell understood without ever being able to prove or prosecute. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "He'll be watching us closer than ever, waiting for an excuse." "Now we wait," Samuel said. "We do our work, we keep our heads down, we survive. But something changed today, sister. Something important. Caldwell knows now that there are limits to his power over me. He won't acknowledge it, probably won't even admit it to himself, but he knows. And that knowledge will make him cautious, not kind, never kind, but cautious. And in this world we live in, sometimes cautious is the best we can hope for." Sarah appeared in the barn doorway then, her small silhouette backlit by the morning sun. "Mama, Uncle Samuel, are we safe now?" Margaret looked at her brother, and Samuel turned his face toward his niece's voice. He smiled, and it was a genuine smile this time, free of the terrible weight he'd been carrying. "Come here, Sarah girl," he said, opening his arms. The child ran to him, and he picked her up easily, settling her on his knee. "You're safe today. That's all anyone can promise. You're safe today." The summer days that followed were strange and tense. Master Caldwell went ahead with his Saturday gathering, hosting planters from Natchez, Vidalia, and even one from across the river in Mississippi. Samuel performed for them, demonstrating his strength and his uncanny ability to navigate the plantation grounds despite his blindness. The guests were impressed, as Caldwell had known they would be. They talked about bloodlines and breeding, about the value of exceptional slaves, about how Caldwell had really lucked out with this one. But Caldwell himself was distant during the gathering, distracted in a way his guests noticed but couldn't quite place. He drank more than usual, laughed less, and his eyes kept drifting towards Samuel with an expression that might have been wariness, or might have been something deeper. When one of the Natchez planters offered $2,000 for Samuel on the spot, Caldwell refused so quickly and firmly that the offer wasn't repeated. Margaret was moved to the kitchen house, as Briggs had said. It was considered a promotion, indoor work being generally easier than field labor, but everyone understood it for what it really was. Caldwell wanted Samuel's sister, where he could monitor her, where house servants would report her every word and action. It was surveillance disguised as favor, control masquerading as kindness. But even with the increased scrutiny, life settled into a new rhythm. Clean. The other enslaved people treated Margaret and Samuel with a kind of quiet respect that hadn't been there before. Nothing was said explicitly, but everyone had witnessed what happened that Friday morning, and everyone had drawn their own conclusions. The story spread beyond the Caldwell plantation, the way stories always did in the enslaved community. In whispered conversations at river crossings where different plantation workers met, in churches where black people gathered on Sundays under white supervision, in the hidden spaces where information flowed along invisible networks, people talked about the blind giant who had faced down his master without raising a hand, who had saved his sister's child through nothing but words and presence and an unbreakable certainty about his own worth. Some of the stories were exaggerated, as stories always are. They said Samuel had threatened Caldwell openly, that he'd promised violence, that he'd shown supernatural power. None of that was true, but the emotional truth beneath the exaggerations was real enough. Something had happened on the Caldwell plantation that challenged the fundamental assumptions of the system. A slave had asserted his humanity in a way that a master had been forced to recognize, however reluctantly. August turned to September. The cotton came in heavy and thick, requiring every available hand to pick it before the weather turned. Samuel worked the wagon teams, hauling cotton from the fields to the gin, his massive strength making him more efficient than any two other workers. Margaret and Sarah picked alongside the other women and children, their hands moving through the bowls with practiced efficiency, their backs aching by day's end. Caldwell watched them all with hooded eyes, his mind working through problems he wouldn't discuss with anyone. The truth was, Samuel had terrified him that morning, and the fear hadn't diminished with time. It had grown, taken root, become something he couldn't shake. Every time he saw the blind giant moving confidently through the plantation, every time he heard other slaves mention Samuel's name with that particular tone of respect, he felt his control slipping incrementally. Not in ways he could point to or punish, but in ways that mattered more than physical rebellion ever could. The thing about fear, though, is that it curdles into hatred if left long enough, and hatred demands release. By October, Caldwell had made a decision. He couldn't kill Samuel, that would be too obviously wasteful of valuable property and would raise questions he didn't want to answer. He couldn't sell Samuel because that would look like weakness, like he'd been forced to get rid of a slave he couldn't control, but he could break Samuel's spirit. He could find ways to remind the giant of his place, to chip away at that unshakable dignity until nothing remained but the proper subservience a slave was supposed to show. He started with small cruelties. Samuel's food rations were reduced. His work assignments became harder, more dangerous. When Samuel completed them anyway without complaint, Caldwell escalated. He had Samuel whipped for minor infractions, real or imagined. The first time, 5 lashes for supposedly not working fast enough. The second time, 10 lashes for talking back, though Samuel had said nothing disrespectful. The third time, 15 lashes for no stated reason at all, just because Caldwell wanted to reassert his authority. Samuel endured it all with the same patient silence he'd always shown. He didn't cry out when the whip fell. He didn't beg for mercy. He simply took the punishment, his massive body absorbing blows that would have destroyed smaller men, and then he went back to work. His blind eyes never showed fear, never showed anger, never showed anything except a distant awareness that seemed to exist outside the immediate pain of the moment. But Margaret saw what it was doing to him. She saw the way Samuel moved more carefully in the mornings, his back screaming with every motion. She saw the blood seeping through his shirt from wounds that hadn't been given time to heal before new ones were added. She saw the way the other enslaved people looked at Samuel with growing horror and impotent rage, watching one of their strongest being slowly destroyed by a white man's fear. She confronted her brother one evening in late October, finding him alone near the barn where they'd spoken so many times before. "You have to do something," she said urgently. "He's killing you slowly. Everyone can see it." Samuel shook his head. "This is what I expected," he said quietly. "I knew, when I stood up to him, that there would be consequences. Men like Caldwell can't let challenges go unanswered, even silent ones. Especially silent ones." "Then what was the point?" Margaret's voice cracked with frustration and grief. "You saved Sarah, but you're destroying yourself. How is that better?" "Because Sarah is alive and here," Samuel said simply. "Because you still have your daughter, because sometimes the price we pay for protecting the people we love is measured in our own suffering, and that's a price worth paying." "I don't want you to pay it," Margaret whispered. "You're my brother. You're all I have besides Sarah." "If he kills you—" "He won't kill me," Samuel interrupted gently. "That would be too final, too definite. Caldwell doesn't want me dead. He wants me broken. He wants to prove to himself and everyone else that he can reduce me to nothing, that the strength I showed him that day was a fluke or a trick or something he imagined. He needs that proof, because without it, he has to live with the knowledge that his power has limits, and that knowledge is eating him alive." Margaret understood the logic, but logic didn't make watching her brother suffer any easier. She reached out, carefully touching the edge of Samuel's torn shirt, where fresh blood had soaked through. He flinched slightly, then steadied himself. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry this is happening because of me and Sarah." "Don't be sorry," Samuel said firmly. "I made my choice with clear eyes. Well, clear enough." He smiled slightly at his own joke. "This isn't your fault, Margaret. This is the system showing its true face. Caldwell isn't an aberration. He's just more honest about the violence that holds all of this together. And sometimes, honestly, I prefer honest cruelty to the kind that pretends to be kindness." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. William Briggs appeared, his face grim. "Samuel, Master wants you at the big house." "Now?" Samuel stood slowly, carefully. "Yes, sir. I'm coming." Margaret felt ice settle in her stomach. Late evening summons to the big house rarely meant anything good. She watched her brother follow the overseer across the yard, his tall figure disappearing into the gathering darkness. and she had the terrible feeling that something fundamental was about to shift again. Inside the big house, Thornton Caldwell sat in his study, a room lined with books he'd never read and furniture imported from Europe to impress visitors. He was drunk, not falling down drunk, but the mean, calculating drunk that made him more dangerous rather than less. When Samuel was brought in, Caldwell studied him for a long moment, taking in the torn shirt, the evidence of recent whipping, the careful way Samuel held himself. "Do you know why I bought your mother?" Caldwell asked abruptly. Samuel turned his blind eyes toward the voice. "No, master." "She was cheap," Caldwell said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "That's why. 17 years old, pregnant with you already. The previous owner happy to unload her because everyone could see there was something wrong with the baby she was carrying. That would be you, Samuel. The blind baby nobody wanted. My father bought her for $200, 1/3 what he'd normally pay for a healthy Negro woman. He figured even if the baby was worthless, she could work, could have more children later." Samuel said nothing, but something in his posture had changed, a subtle stiffening that Briggs noticed even if Caldwell, in his drunken state, didn't. "But you know what?" Caldwell continued, leaning forward in his chair. "She only had the one child, just you. Died bringing you into the world, bled out before the midwife could stop it. So my father's investment was a loss. $200 for a dead woman and a blind baby who couldn't even see his own hand in front of his face." Caldwell stood up, walked closer to Samuel, looked up at the giant who towered over him. "My father wanted to get rid of you, sell you to someone who needed a charity case, or just leave you in the woods to die. But my mother, God rest her meddling soul, she said no. She said even a blind Negro could be useful eventually if raised right. And she was right, wasn't she? You did become useful, very useful indeed." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "But here's what I've been thinking about lately," Caldwell said, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. "Your mother paid for you with her life, and my family gave you life when we could have taken it away. Seems to me you owe us everything, Samuel. Your existence, your strength, whatever it is you think makes you special. All of it exists because we allowed it. So when you stand in my yard and speak to me the way you did back in July, when you look at me with those dead eyes like you're judging me, like you're better than me, it's not just disrespectful, it's ungrateful. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes, master," Samuel said quietly. "I understand what you're saying." "Good," Caldwell said, "because I need you to understand something else. That demonstration you gave, that little performance where you thought you were showing me your power, all that showed me was that you needed to be reminded who actually holds power here. Every lash you've felt since then, that's been your education, and it's going to continue until I'm satisfied that the lesson has been learned." Samuel stood there, absorbing this, his blind eyes fixed on something beyond Caldwell's shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "May I ask you a question, master?" Caldwell was surprised but nodded. "Go ahead. What do you think my mother would say if she could see what you're doing to me?" The question hung in the air like smoke. It was dangerous, potentially suicidal, but Samuel had asked it with such genuine curiosity that Caldwell found himself actually considering it rather than immediately lashing out. "What does that matter?" Caldwell said finally. "She's dead." "Yes, sir, she is," Samuel agreed. "Died, bringing me into a world where I'd be enslaved from my first breath to my last. Died so I could live in darkness, literal and metaphorical both. But before she died, in those 17 years she lived, do you think she ever imagined that the child in her belly would grow up to be beaten by the son of the man who owned her? Do you think that's what she hoped for when she felt me moving inside her?" Caldwell's face darkened. "You're trying to make me feel guilty. It won't work." "I'm not trying to make you feel anything, master," Samuel said softly. I'm just wondering about hope. About what people hope for before the world shows them what's actually possible. My mother hoped I'd live. Your mother hoped I'd be useful. I hope my sister's daughter grows up to see a different world than this one. We all hope for things, Master Caldwell. Even you. And I'm wondering if maybe, sometimes, the hoping is the only thing that keeps us human. There was a long silence. Briggs stood near the door, his hand still resting on his pistol, expecting this conversation to explode into violence at any moment. But Caldwell just stared at Samuel with an expression that was impossible to read. Anger, yes, but also something else. Something that might have been recognition, or might have been the exact opposite. "Get out," Caldwell finally said, his voice flat. "Get out of my sight." Samuel turned to leave, his movements careful and controlled. He was almost to the door when Caldwell spoke again. "Samuel." The giant paused. "I haven't decided yet if I'm going to sell you or keep you," Caldwell said. "But either way, one thing is certain. You will be broken. One way or another you will learn your place. And when that day comes, I want you to remember that it didn't have to be this way. You could have just been a good slave. But you chose different. And this is where choices lead in the world we live in." Samuel didn't respond. He simply walked out of the big house, back into the October night, his tall figure swallowed by shadows. Behind him, Caldwell poured another whiskey and wondered why breaking one blind slave felt so desperately important, why it consumed his thoughts more than any other aspect of managing his plantation, why Samuel's quiet dignity felt like a personal attack on everything Caldwell believed about himself and his place in the world. The answer, had he been honest enough to face it, was simple. Samuel's existence, his unbreakable sense of self-worth, despite the circumstances of his birth and life, challenged the fundamental lie that made slavery possible, that some people were inherently less human than others. And if that lie wasn't true, if people like Samuel could possess the same dignity and worth as people like Caldwell, despite all the laws and customs and violence that said otherwise, then Caldwell's entire identity, his entire worldview, was built on sand. But Caldwell wasn't honest enough to face that. So instead, he drank and he planned, and he waited for an opportunity to prove what he needed to believe. That power came from ownership. That strength was violence, that control was the only truth that mattered. That opportunity came in late November. A group of slave catchers arrived at the Caldwell plantation, tracking 3 runaways from a property in Mississippi. They'd followed the trail across the river, through the forests of Tensas Parish, and they believed the fugitives might be hiding somewhere on Caldwell's land. It wasn't uncommon. Large plantations with extensive timber holdings offered good places to hide for people desperate enough to run. Caldwell organized a search, calling together his overseers and trusted slaves to comb the property. Samuel was included, his ability to move through the woods despite his blindness, making him valuable for this kind of work. The search party spread out through the timber sections, looking for any sign of the runaways. Samuel found them first, not by sight, obviously, but by sound and smell, and that peculiar awareness he'd developed over years of navigating without vision. He heard their breathing, heard the tiny sounds of people trying desperately to stay hidden, smelled the fear sweat and exhaustion. They were hiding in a dense thicket near the edge of Caldwell's property. 3 people, 2 men, and a woman. They'd been running for days, maybe weeks. They were starving and terrified. Samuel stood at the edge of the thicket, knowing exactly where they were, knowing he could call out to the searchers and lead them directly to the fugitives. That was what he was supposed to do. That was what a good slave would do, helping his master recover valuable property, proving his loyalty. But Samuel thought about his mother, who had died bringing him into slavery. He thought about his sister, who had almost lost her daughter to the sugar plantations. He thought about hope, about what people hoped for before the world crushed those hopes. And he thought about the choice he'd made back in July, the choice to value human dignity over survival, to risk everything rather than pretend he was less than he knew himself to be. He made his decision in a moment, though it felt like it had been building for his entire life. "The searchers are coming from the east," Samuel said quietly, speaking toward the thicket. "They'll be here in maybe 10 minutes. If you go north, stay low, follow the creek bed about half a mile, you'll hit a path that leads to the Wilson property. They're more careless with their patrols than Caldwell. From there, you might be able to make it to the swamps. It's your only chance." There was a long moment of shocked silence from the thicket, then rustling sounds as the fugitives moved, hesitating, uncertain if this was a trap. Samuel turned his back to them, giving them space to decide, to run or not run, to trust or not trust this blind giant who had just offered them the most dangerous gift possible. A chance. They ran. Samuel heard them crashing through the underbrush, heading north like he'd told them. He waited, counting breaths, giving them time to get clear. Then he turned and headed back toward where the other searchers were working, his face showing nothing of what had just happened. He encountered William Briggs 15 minutes later. "Any sign?" the overseer asked. "Nothing in my section," Samuel reported, "but I heard something to the east. Might have been them, might have been deer." The search continued through the afternoon, but the fugitives were gone, swallowed by the vast Louisiana wilderness. They were never found, never caught, never returned to the Mississippi plantation they'd fled from. No one ever knew that Samuel had helped them, that he'd made a choice that could have gotten him killed or worse if discovered. Except Margaret knew. She saw it in the way Samuel moved that evening, in the set of his shoulders, in the quiet satisfaction that radiated from him despite the pain of his healing wounds. She confronted him after dark, in their usual spot near the barn. "You let them go," she said. It wasn't a question. Samuel nodded. "I did." "If anyone finds out, they won't," Samuel said calmly. "There's no proof, no evidence, just 3 runaways who got lucky or smart or both. And even if someone suspected, what could they prove? That a blind man somehow helped fugitives escape through woods he can't even see. It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud." Margaret shook her head, torn between terror at the risk her brother had taken and admiration for the courage it required. "Why, Samuel? Why risk everything for strangers?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his face turned toward the stars he couldn't see. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of all the years he'd spent thinking about questions that had no easy answers. Because every person who escapes is proof that this system isn't as strong as it pretends to be. Because every act of resistance, no matter how small, chips away at the lie that we're meant to be owned. And because... He paused, searching for words. "Because my mother died so I could live, and those 3 people were dying slowly in slavery just like I am. If I have the power to give someone else a chance at life, at real life, how can I not use it? What would it say about me, about who I am at the core, if I turned away from people who needed help when I was the only one who could give it? It was the most dangerous philosophy anyone in their position could hold, and Margaret knew it. But she also knew that her brother had never been like other people, had never been able to accept the limits that the world tried to impose on him. He had been born into darkness and bondage, 2 prisons most people couldn't escape. But somehow, in ways Margaret didn't fully understand, Samuel had escaped them both. Not physically, not in any way that the law would recognize, but internally, where it mattered most. December arrived with unusual cold, frost covering the ground in the mornings, everyone bundled in whatever scraps of clothing they could find. The plantation's rhythm slowed with the season. Cotton was picked and ginned and sold, tobacco was processed and shipped. The enslaved people caught their breath between the autumn harvests and the spring planting, knowing the respite was temporary but grateful for it nonetheless. Master Caldwell grew increasingly erratic as winter deepened. The violence he'd been inflicting on Samuel had not produced the results he wanted. If anything, Samuel seemed more centered, more certain of himself, moving through each day with a grace that made his blindness seem incidental rather than defining. Other enslaved people had started following Samuel's example in small ways, carrying themselves with fractionally more dignity, meeting white people's eyes for fractionally longer, existing in ways that suggested they remembered they were human beings no matter what the law said. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Caldwell felt it. He felt control slipping through his fingers like water, felt the foundations of his power eroding in ways he couldn't articulate or stop. And it was all tied to this blind giant who should have been easy to break, but somehow remained unbreakable. On Christmas Eve, Caldwell made his final decision. He would sell Samuel after all. Not to a local plantation where Samuel's influence might still spread, but to a slave breaker in Georgia, a man notorious for taking difficult slaves and returning them utterly destroyed, capable of work, but stripped of everything that made them human. It would cost money, and Caldwell would lose Samuel's valuable labor, but some prices were worth paying to restore the natural order of things. He informed William Briggs of his decision on Christmas morning. The overseer was surprised, worried even. "Samuel's the strongest worker we have," Briggs pointed out, "and he's been docile lately, no real trouble. You sure you want to get rid of him?" "I'm sure," Caldwell said flatly. "Arrange the sale. I want him gone by New Year's." But Caldwell made a mistake. He told the wrong house servant about his plans, a woman who had been born on the plantation and who had watched Samuel grow from a blind baby into a woman who had been born on the plantation and who had watched Samuel grow from a blind baby into the man he'd become. She slipped away that afternoon and found Margaret in the kitchen house, whispering the news urgently. Margaret felt her world tilt. A slave breaker in Georgia meant death, just a slower, crueler death than a bullet would provide. She found Samuel that evening, her voice shaking as she told him what was coming. Samuel listened without expression, then nodded once. "I thought it might come to this," he said quietly. "Caldwell can't let me exist the way I am. It challenges too much of what he needs to believe." "So what do we do?" Margaret asked desperately. "You can't go to Georgia. You know what they'll do to you there." "I know," Samuel said. He was quiet for a long moment, thinking, calculating, weighing impossible options. Then he looked at his sister with his blind eyes and said something that stopped her breath. "There might be a way. But if I do this, if I take this chance, you have to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll keep Sarah safe. You'll teach her that she's worth something, that being enslaved doesn't make her less human. You'll make sure she remembers that her uncle believed freedom was real, even when he couldn't touch it. Can you promise me that?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning to hope," Samuel said gently. "One last time. I'm planning to believe that sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, the impossible becomes possible." He didn't explain further, and Margaret didn't press him. But as she walked back to her cabin that night, holding Sarah's hand, she felt the weight of her brother's words settling over her like a heavy blanket. Samuel was planning something that might save him or might destroy him, but something that would at least be his choice to make. And in a world where enslaved people had almost no choices at all, even the choice of how to face death carried its own kind of terrible freedom. End of part 2, continuing directly to conclusion. Conclusion. New Year's Eve, 1858, came cold and clear. Master Caldwell hosted another gathering, smaller than his summer parties but still significant, planters from nearby properties coming to celebrate the turning year with whiskey and cards and conversations about cotton prices. The house glowed with candlelight. Music drifted from the windows where a hired musician played violin. Everything was festive, elegant, civilized. In the quarters, the enslaved people held their own gathering, quieter, but no less meaningful. They sang hymns and spirituals, the songs carrying coded meanings about freedom and deliverance that white people either didn't recognize or pretended not to. Samuel stood at the edge of the group, his tall figure outlined against the winter sky, listening to voices rise and fall in harmonies that had traveled across oceans and generations. At midnight, when the white people in the big house were drinking toasts to 1859, Samuel walked away from the quarters. He moved with purpose, his feet carrying him toward the place where he'd first confronted Caldwell months ago, where fence posts still stood in positions he'd arranged. Margaret saw him go and felt ice in her chest, but she didn't follow. Sarah slept against her side, exhausted from the evening's festivities, and Margaret held her daughter close, waiting. Samuel reached the barn and stopped. He stood there, his face turned upward toward stars he couldn't see, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember what hope felt like. Not the desperate, clinging hope of survival, but the wild, dangerous hope of possibility. The hope that said maybe, just maybe, the world could be different than it was. That systems could be challenged, that dignity could not be taken, only surrendered. That even in darkness, literal and metaphorical, a person could find their own light. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, unsurprised, to face Thornton Caldwell. The master had drunk too much as usual and had stepped outside for air and had seen Samuel standing alone in the darkness. "Tomorrow?" Caldwell said, his words slightly slurred. "Tomorrow you go to Georgia. I wanted you to know that, wanted to see your face when you realized it was really happening." Samuel nodded slowly. "I know, Master. I heard." "Good," Caldwell said. "So you understand. Everything you thought you were, everything you pretended to be, it all ends tomorrow. By this time next month, you'll be exactly what you should have been from the start. A tool, an object, nothing more." "Maybe," Samuel said quietly. "Or maybe you're wrong about what I am. Maybe you've always been wrong." Caldwell laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Still proud even now. Well, let's see how long that lasts in Georgia." He turned to walk away, dismissing Samuel with that turn, reasserting his power through the simple act of ending the conversation on his terms. But he'd taken only 3 steps when Samuel spoke again, and something in his voice made Caldwell stop and turn back. "Master Caldwell," Samuel said, "I want to thank you." "Thank me?" Caldwell's voice dripped skepticism. "For what?" "For showing me who I am," Samuel said simply. "You've spent months trying to break me, trying to prove that I'm nothing but property. And every time you failed, every time I stood back up, every time I held on to the part of myself that you can't touch, no matter how hard you try, I learned something important. I learned that I'm more than you'll ever be, because I know what it means to survive with dignity, while you only know what it means to destroy without courage." The words hung in the cold air between them. For a moment, just a moment, Thornton Caldwell saw himself reflected in those blind eyes. He saw a man whose power came entirely from systems he hadn't built, laws he hadn't written, violence he commanded others to perform. He saw a hollowness at his own center, an emptiness that all the land and slaves and money in the world couldn't fill. He saw what Samuel had been trying to show him all along, that true strength had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with remaining human in circumstances designed to strip humanity away. Then, the moment passed, and Caldwell's face twisted with rage. He raised his hand to strike Samuel, to finally unleash the physical violence he'd been proxy-inflicting for months. But Samuel didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't show even a flicker of fear. He simply stood there, 7 feet of unshakable certainty, and Caldwell's hand fell back to his side. "Get away from me," Caldwell whispered, and there was something broken in his voice. "Just get away." Samuel nodded and walked past him, back toward the quarters, leaving Caldwell standing alone in the darkness. The master stayed there for a long time, shaking with emotions he couldn't name, staring at nothing, feeling like he'd just lost something important, but unable to define what it was. In the quarters, Margaret waited for her brother. When he appeared, moving with that same confident stride despite everything, she stood and met him halfway. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Samuel pulled his sister into an embrace, holding her the way he'd held her when they were children, and the world was even more impossible than it was now. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he whispered into her hair, "remember that we survived. Not just our bodies, but us. The parts that matter. Remember that, Margaret, and teach it to Sarah. Can you do that?" "I can," Margaret whispered back. "I will." They stood together as the old year died and the new year was born, two people who had been marked as property by law, but who had never, in the deepest parts of themselves, accepted that marking. Around them, others slept, or sang, or prayed, all of them caught in the same system, all of them finding their own ways to remain human despite everything designed to make them less. And somewhere in the big house, Thornton Caldwell sat alone with his whiskey, wondering why victory felt so much like defeat, why breaking one blind slave mattered so much, and why Samuel's quiet dignity had shaken him more than any rebellion ever could. The answer, had he been able to face it, was simple. Samuel had won. Not by escaping, not by fighting back, not by overthrowing the system. He had won by refusing to let slavery enter his soul. He had won by remaining himself. And that kind of victory, invisible to the law but undeniable in its reality, was the most dangerous kind of all. Because if one person could do it, others could too. And if enough people remembered their own humanity, despite systems built to make them forget, then those systems, no matter how powerful they seemed, would eventually crumble into dust. The future would prove Samuel right. Slavery would end, though not in his lifetime. The Caldwell plantation would fall into ruin, the big house would burn, the fields would go fallow, the entire structure would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. But before all that, in the cold darkness of New Year's morning 1859, one blind man stood tall and remembered what it meant to be human. And that remembering, passed down through generations, would outlast every law, every chain, every attempt to make people believe they were less than they were. Samuel went to Georgia. The historical record, if there was one, doesn't say what happened to him there, but maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some stories don't need endings that satisfy our need for closure. Maybe it's enough to know that he lived with dignity, that he protected the people he loved, that he challenged a system meant to destroy him and remained unbroken where it mattered most. And maybe, in ways we can't